Access Sacramento presents a special hometown TV broadcast. This program is funded in part by a grant from the Sacramento Metropolitan Cable Television Commission.
We as women, we as the matriarch society come together today to put our minds and spirits together on behalf of our Mother Earth, on behalf of the waters, on behalf of the air and the sun, on behalf of the soil. Mothers, all coming together. Can we hold hands? Mothers, can we hold hands? For all that are here, we all came from a mother and a father. We held inside the waters for anywhere from 26 weeks to 9 months, and sometimes and beyond. The prayers of our ancestors came through the DNA of our people. We tell the stories by way of beadwork, song, dance. We tell the stories of the mother by way of the fabric, by way of our hairstyles, by way of our markings on our skin. We tell the story of the history of our matriarchs, us, the ones who spoke to the birds when we couldn't speak each other's language, the ones who sang the songs, the moans and groans while giving birth in the fields, while enslaved. We have never been enslaved. Our minds have been free enough to create new beings, new spirits, new souls. Mothers of the earth, of this Mother Earth, we ask that we all come together, remembering that we came from the water, we came from the breath, we came from the blood of our ancestors that came before us. Ashe, 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 Ashe.
Thank you. Welcome to the Sojourner Truth Museum. We are so excited to have each and every one of you here today. I'm going to start by speaking of the mission of Sojourner Truth is to open minds and to change lives through the exploration and celebration of African American history, experiences, and culture through art education and outreach. Our vision is a world in which the adversity and achievement of African American history inspire everyone toward a greater understanding of acceptance and unity. The museum is named for Sojourner Truth, who, although born a slave, worked tirelessly for abolition, women's rights, nonviolence, and civil and economic advancement of oppressed people. The museum gives homage to Miss Sojourner Truth by expanding the historical and biographical knowledge of her life's work and carrying on her mission by teaching, demonstrating, and promoting projects that situate the ideals and principles of which she stood. The first Mother's Breastfeeding Project fits into this mission. There is no better honor for the Sojourner Truth Museum than to be a part of a solution to save Black infants. We want them to grow up as healthy human beings and be productive citizens in their communities. The Sojourner Truth will work hard to anchor for change in this crisis. We thank you all for being here today.
My name is Ron Cook. I'm the curator here at the Sojourner Truth Museum. Shona and I have been working together for almost a decade. When I came to this museum and I saw how the women worked together, because that was a big thing for me, because I never saw so many women artists so busy at what they do, creating images that celebrate women, that celebrate birth, that celebrate life. We want to thank Access Sacramento, okay, because they were the first ones to jump in and say, yeah, it's a good project, let's do it. We want to thank the Sacramento Breastfeeding Coalition, because more importantly, Jeanette and Samantha and their group was so supportive of us. You know, I just have to say thank you twice, because first of all, they knew we didn't know a whole lot. We have some information. We want to share it, okay? So that's how we come to the table. We have so much knowledge that well, let me say this. We have so much knowledge we wanted to share, all right? We didn't know how to present ourselves in the healthcare community, but we say, hey, as a museum, we know about knowledge and we know about information. So let's go at it like that. Yeah, so we want to thank the Links. We want to thank the Florin Business Complex, Mr. Donaldson, the Breastfeeding Coalition. I can't say enough about them, okay, because they didn't judge us. They said, hey, they don't know a lot, but let's just work with them. So we thank you for that, okay? We really do. So now, we have the first mothers here. They're going to tell you a little story, and because they all have different areas of interest and different areas of focus with breastfeeding. They're all great mothers who breastfed their kids, love their kids, but more importantly, and just as important, they love everybody else's kid too. So that's why they're here today. So,
Peace and blessings, everyone.
Peace and blessings.
Well, my name is Yolanda Muhammad. I'm a mother of 7, and I breastfed all 7 of my children. I'm a grandmother of 35 grandchildren, wow, and a great-grandmother of 10 great-grandchildren and 1 on the way. And to me, it's very important to breastfeed. That breast milk, I'm just gonna talk from my heart if you all don't mind, okay? Breast milk to me is a golden liquid. It's very powerful, very nutrient, full of minerals and vitamins and all the things that the baby needs, okay? Breastfeeding my children, it was a wonderful experience. I would never trade it for anything else. That was the best thing that ever happened to me, as I always say, having my children and traveling to Africa all the time. But bonding with my babies, it brought such a close connection between me and my children. I couldn't leave them alone. Even after having them in the hospital, I did not allow the nurses to take my children away from me. They stayed with me, which was called room in, you know. So they stayed with me all the time until I left and went home. But that bond that was created between me and my children, it still stands to this day. My oldest daughter is 45 years old, okay? And she still had that close connection with me. She still comes and lay on me, older she is and bigger than me, you know? But we still have that bond. And all of my children, we have that closeness together, that togetherness because of the breastfeeding, you know? And my children, they were sick less than other children who wasn't breastfed, okay? And now my children, they breastfed as well, and so is my my grandchildren. They're breastfeeding too. And also I want to stress the importance of eating healthy before, you know, you conceive, and also during pregnancy and then after pregnancy. Breastfeeding is very, very important to eat healthy. There is a food called moringa. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the moringa. Yes. It's a miracle tree, they call it, a very, very powerful tree, the tree of consciousness. And I would like to say that the moringa is a good food for a mother that is expecting to consume, because it has all the vitamins and minerals and nutrients in it that an expectant mother, anybody, period, because moringa is healing people. They even using it in helping cancer patients, just like breast milk. Okay, let me put that out there. Breast milk, they're using breast milk as well to help heal and to build up the immune system of cancer patients, okay? So moringa is a very, very powerful food. Come from West Africa and over in Asia and India and places like that. If you look up moringa and research, you will see how powerful the moringa is. So I would like to say for the mothers to look into moringa. And I have another testimony. I have a granddaughter who I gave moringa to as part of her prenatal treatment, okay? And it increased her breast milk. When she gave birth, the milk just came, just flowing, because the moringa increases the breast milk. So the baby didn't get enough. Okay, it was so much that it was producing. But anyway, thank you all for listening, and I'm glad to be a part of this here breastfeeding conference. Peace and blessings.
Bliss B. My name is Shawana Thrower. I'm one of the more radical ones here. How's everyone doing today?
I heard that.
We're here because this is the first Mother's Black Infant Death and Breastfeeding Forum, and Sacramento has a very high rate of Black infant death, and that should be a major concern to all of us. As it relates to breastfeeding, I have 5 children. I breastfed them all. My youngest is 20, my oldest is 32, and I do advocate for breastfeeding. I think it is the most important food on the planet. I think it gives everybody a proper start to life. And when we look at the studies that have been done on breastfeeding and why breastfeeding is important, psychologically it helps a child bond psychologically to their parent and socially to the environment. It also strengthens their immune system. My children never got sick when they were breastfeeding. I breastfed my oldest son till he was almost 3. I breastfed my daughter. I have 1 daughter and 4 sons. My daughter till she was almost 2. I breastfed my middle child until he was a year old, and I breastfed my 2 last children at least 3 months. So that first colostrum that comes out, it really builds up the child's immune system. When we look at when Black infant death or SIDS or Black mortality, infant mortality rates began to climb in this country, it is largely associated with the fact that formulas were introduced into their diet. So I think it's very important that we understand the importance of breastfeeding and why we need to advocate for that, especially in the African American communities. And not just, when I say African American, if you look back in history, Black women breastfed white babies.
Thank you.
Okay, so don't get mad at me, I didn't do that. So when I say that, I mean everybody, not just Black people, okay? Because if it wasn't for the breast milk of African women, there would be some European babies that wouldn't have lived, and therefore some of us wouldn't be here. I have European blood in me as well. So when I advocate for anything that's African or African American, I'm advocating for everybody, okay? So when I say that, don't be offended, but I am a little radical. So, I think it's very important, breastfeeding. Our children are physically advanced, and when you look back in slavery and why they had Black women breastfeeding the European babies, it was because the breast milk that the African women was producing was superior. And our children, studies have been done. There's a study that was brought to my attention by Michelle Gieber, who went to Africa. She was a Yale graduate. She studied anthropology. She went to Africa, to Uganda, and to Kenya. There's books that are written that refer to her studies. She was funded by the UN and by Yale to study the difference between African babies and European babies, or modern births and African births. And by far, the African children were more precocious, they developed faster, they sat up faster, they held their heads up faster, they learned to do things such as climbing stairs at an earlier rate, they learned to retrieve certain images that were out of sight. Say they did a study where the babies were given a ball, and if the ball was put in a box across the room and out of their sight, the African babies were more likely to mentally associate the fact that that ball was still in the box even though it was out of sight, whereas the European babies, once the ball was out of sight, it was out of mind. These are just things that did not happen by chance. The DNA found in certain tribes in Cameroon go back even beyond the DNA of that Adam gene that we've been told our human ancestors come from. Okay, so it is very important that we understand the power of our children and the power of breastfeeding our children and having our children be healthy, because we do not understand what we are doing by not advocating for our children. We are really limiting the process of the planet and the earth for the good of all people. So when we look at infant mortality rates and how high they are in this country, they're higher than certain third world countries. And I would like to advocate that we all pull together to support the process of understanding why this is occurring.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mayani Pugh, and I have worked with Black Infant Health, Birth and Beyond, the mother-baby programs, the majority of the homeless shelters here in Sacramento, California. And I've actually been advocating for breastfeeding ever since I gave birth to my first child in 1976, 77. Okay, guess what? Yeah, he's going to be 40 in a minute. But the whole idea of breastfeeding for me was because of the fact that I was born with a special gene, which is it's an albumin. It's a blood albumin. I have an AE albumin, and I am an only child, and my father was an only child, and I have allergies that other people sometimes don't have, asthmatics from 6-month-old on. So I knew that any being that came from my womb was going to need me, because there was nobody else for me to give them to. Unlike when I was born, my my father's first cousin and my aunt, they breastfed me along with my cousins. And so we, as a unit, I come from Nicodemus, Kansas. It's a all black and Indian settlement in the middle of the United States, in Graham County. It still exists to this day, founded in 1874. So right after Reconstruction, we were still breastfeeding. We never stopped. We had families. My grandmother had 13 children. Her sister had 13. And then, plus we had multiple births. So the Ibeji, the twins, were extreme because we are Yoruba people. So there are more twins and triplets per capita in the Yoruba land in Nigeria, West Africa, than there are in the whole world. So having multiple breastfeeding situations happen consistently, because my grandmother gave birth to 2 sets of twins, her sister gave birth to 2 sets of twins, and then they multiplied. So we have all these twins and triplets. I didn't get that opportunity, but Creator's given me prayer for everybody, so I'm thankful for that. But I gave birth for my last birth to a 1 pound 9 ounce baby. He fit in my hand. His name is longer than himself. His name is Jacques Pani Daude Lafayette Nepieu Kepler. He has the history of my family, both my family and his father's family, all names leading back beyond 1600s. And I just felt the need to not only breastfeed him because he was the littlest thing. Now, I weighed about 225 and I was rushing. So I just knew I was having this gigantic baby. I knew I was having a 10-pounder. All the rest of them had been 6'4", 6'14", 6'12". And here I was now, bigger than I'd ever been in my life. And when the baby came, I found out that I had toxemia and that I was swelling from the inside out. More or less, and that my body was rejecting my child. After birth, we found that when he came at 26 weeks gestation at UC Davis Medical Center, so he's a UC Davis Medical Center miracle baby, but he's a miracle because even though they told me I wasn't supposed to breastfeed, I continued to pump. I was 39 years old when I gave birth to my last son. And my grandmother was 43 when she gave birth to my mother, who was her last child. So in our blood lineage, we've always not only given birth past 30 and 40, but also breastfed. I also breastfed my twin goddaughters when I was breastfeeding both of my children's two. They were 2.5 years apart at that time. And because the mothers had to go to work, I had one set of twins and one other goddaughter with me that were the exact same ages of my babies. So in Berkeley, North Oakland, Berkeley, I was breastfeeding. I was doing what we did way back in time in the fields and, in the White House. I did what I knew was the correct thing to do because we still had to survive. So we came together as a cooperative unit to collect our breast milk because at that time in the 1970s, from 76 on to 84, I remember when I gave birth to my son in 77, breast milk was going for $160 a pint at that time. And so I don't know what the price is at this moment in time, but I'm sure people with a lot of money can buy breast milk. It's $80 an ounce, they say. Well, more than mota. Okay, excuse me. Didn't mean to go there. But I mean, I state that to say natural. One of my specialties was to be able to use my herbs and the yeast. Red clover, comfrey. I used, I'm lactose intolerant, but when I was pregnant with my son, I could do buttermilk and ice cream combinations that built up my breast milk, but I added brewer's yeast to it. And because I didn't know about this great herb from Africa at the time, I just knew that the combination of rice and beans and all of the proteins that I was going to need, everything that I could grow in my garden, I blended in smoothies. Because after birth, I had the blues, so I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to eat anything. So all I could do was blend and juice. So I juiced about a quart of carrot juice a day, and I drank that. I also blended, and at that time I was completely vegan, so there was no flesh. I had stopped doing all forms of dairy because the asthma got to kicking in. And then I saw it in my baby. As the breast milk came through, when I was using the milk, my son was congested. And I had to change my diet in order for him not to be hospitalized. And so with the baby, he is now 24 years old, 14 and a half shoe. He's standing, towering over all his siblings, but 1 pound, 9 ounces. I say that breast milk does wonders in life. That without the passion of the blood of our lives that we hold from within, our DNA, all the stressors that probably brought me to the point that I had a baby, with generational stressors from slavery until now, the stress that it's hard for a man that's broke to think how is he going to take care of a child. All of these things are elements that have to do with the carrying of a baby. There's a whole lot of domestic violence that goes down during the time of a birth, of the carrying of a child and the birth of a child. The fear that we have nowadays. Our children are taught that it's a shame for us to give birth, for us to give life to a new generation. We are taught that, 2, maybe 3. When I got ready to give birth to my 4th child, I remember they talked to me like I was a dog. I literally lost friends because I was pregnant and not on stage singing and dancing like I was supposed to be. And it was for me to say that these were my sisters, and then all of a sudden I get ready to give birth to this beautiful life that I had no idea was going to be 1 pound, 9 ounces. And they sent 16 or 17 people into me to get me to sign my baby over, saying that he would never be able to walk, never be able to speak, never be able to see, never be able to function. He was going to be a vegetable. I said, nothing that came from this womb. I am my mother's daughter, my grandmother's granddaughter, my great-grandmother's great-granddaughter, and those who came before me. The strength of my being not only holds as an indigenous to this land, indigenous to the continent, but indigenous to Europe.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Michelle Sunshine. I am the mother of 3. My oldest is 17. My middle is 3. He's 3, almost 4. And then I have this beautiful baby girl sitting with us right now. Her name is Delphinia. She is 10 months. And I am, Brother Cook and I talked about this project. I think when I was pregnant with my son, so this has been a number of years in the making, and I'm really honored to be here and to share the stage and the table with women who are my elders. This is really a very special place for me to be, and to be able to share my experience with breastfeeding. I think one of the things that struck me, particularly with my last two births, is that here in this country, especially when pregnancy is treated as it's a diagnosis. It's treated as a medical condition rather than a natural process of procreation, rather than a spiritual process of bringing in a new person into a new being into this world, into this plane of existence. And this is really it was really disconcerting on a personal level, but also I think culturally, because we come from such a very long history and a very strong history, even if we're not taught it. We have to seek it ourselves. But we come from a very long history and a very strong history of birth being a spiritual process and it being a sacred process, and having the support of our aunties and our sisters and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers, and having all of these women around us to support us and usher us through this process, especially as young mothers. This is not something that happens here. And oftentimes we are isolated. We do catch a lot of flack. When I was pregnant with her, everybody was like, oh, are you done now? And I'm like, and what if I'm not? What if I decide to have 6 more? What's it to you? You know, I got very, this was my family. These are people who are supposed to be in my support system, who were giving me all of this. Well, why are you having babies so late? And you're about to be 38. Don't you think you're a little old to have children? It's like, no, actually, I don't. Of course, I said that before I got like really into the pregnancy at 37 and realized that, that it's like that, your body changes. My oldest I had at, my 17-year-old, I had her at 19, turning 20. And so my body was completely different then. It's like I didn't have some of the same aches and pains and swellings and, complications to movement or sleeping that I had with my later 2, and particularly this baby girl right here. But I had some particular challenges with nursing with all of my children. With my oldest, she had a problem latching, not because there was anything mechanically wrong with her mouth, but just because we couldn't get a latch. It's like we talk about breastfeeding like it's a natural process, and while it is a natural process, one of the things that the information that they don't give to new moms is that you have to learn how to do it. You have to learn what way works best for that baby, and the baby has to learn how to latch. The baby has to learn how to breathe and suck and swallow all at the same time. And this isn't we don't address that learning curve with our new mamas, and so there's a lot of stress, unnecessary stress, because women are like, oh my gosh, I can't feed my baby. Baby's 2 days old and she's not latching, or, I'm not producing milk. It's like we don't give that information and say, well, at first you're going to produce colostrum. It doesn't look like regular breast milk. It's thick. It comes slower. The baby has to work a little bit harder to get it. And the colostrum that's given is sufficient. It's like we don't give this information. There are no circles for us to exist in where this information is given freely. We don't have the benefit of the experience of other women who have gone through this, who maybe have had these challenges, who can say, I had this particular challenge. Sister, let me give you some information. Let me let you know that A, it's going to be okay. First of all. Second of all, you got to keep trying. You've got to keep trying. Don't quit after 3 days. Don't quit after 1 week. It's worth it to you, not only for the baby's health, but for your health as well. It's worth it to continue to breastfeed. It's worth it to continue to give that those nutrients to your baby. With my son, he was born 6.5 weeks premature, and so he was in the NICU. And it's interesting how traumatic it is to have the baby taken from you, because it was. I only got 5 minutes of skin to skin after he was born, because they needed to get him to the NICU and check him out and make sure that everything was medically okay. Even though I asked for that, I said, give me my baby, let me hold him, let him be with me. And we only had 5 minutes. And that was probably one of the hardest moments in my life, to watch him be wheeled out in the incubator with all of these wires and tubes and doctors and nurses and everybody like running here and there. And then to watch him be wheeled away from me to go to stay in another part of the hospital. That was incredibly painful, and that was incredibly hard for me. And I still have some issues. I'm still, it's like I'm still trying to work through that, and I still and I think about, it's like these things that happen to our children when they're very small, that they don't necessarily have any cognitive remembrance of. But this was an experience that he had. He had this experience where he was taken away from me and put in a plastic box, and wheeled away with all of these unfamiliar faces, with these unfamiliar smells. With these unfamiliar voices. And I think about, how is that going to impact him in later life? What can I do as his mama to make sure that he feels supported and protected and knows that I'm not going anywhere? I'm not going anywhere. If I have any say about it, I'm going to be right there every step of the way for him. This baby girl had a tongue tie. And so she was they had diagnosed her with a failure to thrive. And it took 3 months before they realized that the problem was with her mouth. It wasn't with my breast milk. It was with the fact that she couldn't latch. And it was, I'm incredibly grateful actually to the lactation consultants at WIC, because it was the lactation consultant that discovered that this was the problem. And as you can see, she's asleep now, but quite healthy. Quite healthy. We did make it through that. But breastfeeding is really very challenging, and it's even more so without support, without the support of family, without the support of partners, without the support of friends. And I know that for me, there's a tendency to isolate when things get challenging. I don't always reach out and say, hey, sister girl, I'm having a hard time. Can you just come over and sit with me? And we have some chocolate ice cream or something, and we just sit, so can I just have some company? I don't always do that. And so one of the things that I was looking at with Delphinia is that I was often alone, and because she couldn't latch, trying to nurse was incredibly painful. And so I had the stress of the improper latch, and then the pain that it was causing me, and then the fact that she wasn't thriving. At 3 months old, she had only gained 3 pounds, which is really, if you know anything about babies, that's way underweight, way, way underweight. She had fallen off of her growth curve, and there was like all of these sort of people were looking at me like, oh, well, what is it that you're doing wrong? Even though I was doing everything I could. I was drinking mother's milk tea every day, and I was taking alfalfa supplements, and I was making sure that I had my prenatals, and I was getting exercise and drinking lots of water and staying hydrated and doing all of these things that are so important when you're nursing. But because she couldn't latch, she couldn't receive the nutrients that were in my breast milk. She couldn't receive it, so her body couldn't use it, so she wasn't growing. And the doctors were like, well, you need to give her formula. And I'm like, but I don't want to give her formula. It's like, how can you tell me that something that's produced in a laboratory is better than what my body produces naturally for my children? How can you tell me? And so that was probably one of my biggest challenges. And I'm really grateful to be able to participate in this, because I would hate for another mama, a young mama, a mama who doesn't have the conviction of heart and of spirit that I have, to go through this and to go through those sorts of things without that support. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, greetings and peace and blessings to each and every one of you. Before I get started, I want to thank Ron Cook for inviting me here, and Shona McDaniel. I've been here since 9 o'clock, and she has been running around working tirelessly, and I know that didn't just start today. I also want to thank the panel, and I'm deeply honored to be in your presence and your amazing stories. So my name is Dr. Heather Clark, and I have been around birthing women for, wow, I hate to say it, 40 years. 37 of those years has been as a nurse midwife. And I was a midwife for 11 years before I had my first child. And when I was pregnant with her, as I got, I knew I didn't want to birth in a hospital. I was deeply afraid to birth in a hospital. I had been around many hospitals on the other side, and I was afraid. I was afraid what they would do to me, what they would do to my baby. I didn't want any separation at all from the baby, and so we birthed at home. We had our two children at home, and our daughters were 18 months apart. I breastfed my first daughter throughout the second pregnancy, and my second child, it turns out, is a very competitive person. And what I didn't know was that she was extremely upset when she arrived and found out that her sister was already here. So literally, when she was born, I had a really bad migraine. And literally for the first 5 days, she would not put the nipple near her mouth. She just refused to breastfeed. And I didn't have, anything else for her because I couldn't think of feeding her anything else besides breast milk. But I think by the 5th day, I started to get concerned, and I asked my sister to go get some formula. And so she made the formula, and I held her, I put the bottle to her mouth. She literally spat the nipple out of her mouth, grabbed the breast, and breastfed for 2 years. So I breastfed the older one for 3 years and the younger for 2, and they were both fed together for 18 months. So our babies are beautiful. They are born beautiful. Look at the joy in their eyes. You look at their eyes and they draw you in. They're very, very intelligent. Most of my career, I've attended births in a number of settings, at home, birth centers in the South, in the urban North, and am always struck by the intelligence of these babies when they're born. They're able to communicate. And if you slow down enough, you will understand what the babies from a very young age are telling you. I became familiar with Dr. Gerber's work through Ron. He introduced me to her. And I have, in my career lately, focused a lot on preconception care and pre- and perinatal psychology. I'm currently not practicing as a midwife. I'm teaching midwives. But what fascinated me about Dr. Gerber's work is her work is now supported by a lot of the recent research on the wisdom and the intelligence of babies. And as it was mentioned before, she was a French psychiatrist who went to Uganda and Kenya to research nutritional deficiencies. And what she discovered was that the African babies were extremely precocious. They were brilliant. They had advanced sensory skills, and she described them as phenomenal and miraculous. The babies were born at home, and often the mother was alone and unassisted. They were never separated from their mothers. The mothers constantly massaged and caressed and sung to them, fondled them continually. She carried them unswaddled, so next to her skin, constantly next to her bare breast. So that meant that the babies could breastfeed at will whenever they wanted to on their own schedule. They were awake most of the time. They were alert, watchful, calm, happy. They hardly ever cried. And their mothers responded to their every whimper and their every move. So if the baby, I watched Sister Sunshine earlier, her baby was attempting to grab something, and she gently moved it closer to the baby. Those were the kind of the behaviors that were natural, where the mothers assisted the babies in their movements so that everything the baby tried to do, they were successful at. At 2.5 days, the baby sat bolt upright with beautiful straight backs and really great control of their heads. And their eyes were really finely focused, mostly staring intently at their mothers. And they just smiled and smiled and smiled. Blood analysis on these babies at 4 days of age showed that the stress hormones related to birth were virtually absent. And let's face it, birth is stressful, right? If you imagine yourself as a little baby squeezing through this narrow passageway, and to get out, you've got to kind of twist and turn a little bit. It's stressful, but there's a certain amount of stress that is healthy for the baby. It builds resilience, and it builds adjustment to the outside world. And if it's a gentle physiological birth, the babies will recover from that stress very easily, particularly if they're not separated from their mothers. And at 2.5 days, these babies started smiling. Really amazing. So in these countries, Uganda and Kenya, they started to build traditional Western hospitals. Only wealthy women could attend births in those hospitals, and they adopted the Western ways of birth and Western ways of child rearing. So they didn't breastfeed. They were separated from the babies, and the babies weren't stimulated as the poorer women in the remote villages. These infants did not smile to 2.5 months of age. There was no precocious or advanced behavior observed. So these are women from the same country, right? Blood analysis showed that even at 2.5 months, there was still a high level of adrenal steroids in the baby's system. These babies slept most of the time. They cried, they were irritable, they were colicky, just not the same kinds of babies. And they were frail and helpless. So this is a result of that kind of childbirth and child rearing. And this is where we are in America today. Black babies are dying at 2.5 times the rates of white babies before they're a year old. Black mothers are dying at 3 times the rate of white women from birth. And that's through 6 weeks to 12 months after the birth. Black women have a greater incidence of low birth weight and very low birth weight babies and preterm birth. So if you bear with me, I'll show some slides that show some statistics of just how bad it is for Black women and babies in America. So the infant mortality rate, the rate at which babies are dying, in America, and this data is from 2013, and I have to say that a lot of the data slides are from Professor Vanilla Randall, who's a nurse practitioner and a JD, who very kindly lent me some of these slides. So you see that the state of infant deaths for Black American babies is worse than some third world countries. Now, when I first saw this presentation, it really opened my eyes because I'm originally from Barbados, and in 10 days, I'm moving back there. But look where we are in relation to a small Caribbean island. I mean, it's really pathetic. Why are our babies dying? So this is neonatal mortality rate. This is the rate of babies who die within the first 28 days of life. Look where we are in relationship to Serbia and Mexico and the Bahamas. We're number 72 in the world. This is the most advanced technological country in the world, right? We should be on top. And the maternal mortality rate, again, we're below Liberia, Grenada, China, Bahamas, number 76 in the world for our mothers dying. I mean, it makes you want to cry. It makes me want to cry. Low birth weight babies, 136 in the world. We're below Botswana. What are we doing wrong? Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda. I had a friend who just spent 3 years in Rwanda as a midwife, and the horror stories she told me about the conditions that women birth in. Not enough supplies, not enough drugs, but look where they are. They're 41 and we're 136. So the life expectancy at birth is really a measure of the overall quality of life in a country. And look where we are for females in the United States. For Black women, the life expectancy is 78.4 years, number 66 in the world. And for Black men, 72.3. So in order to begin to understand how we got where we are now, we have to go back. And we could go way, way back, but we're going to start with the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage and the absolute terrible conditions that people lived through, those that didn't die on the ship or jump over, to survive that incredible journey that took months. No place to go to the bathroom other than around them, terrible food, crowded like sardines on a ship, chained, beaten. And remember, before they got on the ship, they were often made to walk around the tree of forgetfulness about 7 or 9 times to forget their family, their children, their land. Every journey, their language, every journey, their spirituality, they were made to leave, consciously leave that life behind, not knowing where they were going, fearful. But they were resilient, right? They survived. And if you think about it, the ones that survived had the strongest genes, and they brought those forward. So we know from today, there's a lot of research being done on intergenerational influences. And we're discovering that we don't just inherit genes from our ancestors that affect our physical appearance, our eyes, our hair, our muscle structure, our teeth and bone structure. But we also inherit certain psychological traits and belief systems. And if you can imagine the kind of terror that our ancestors went through on this journey, that was brought forward. And we know from scientific evidence today that intergenerational influences are brought forward 3 to 4 generations, and they go back at least 3 to 4 generations. And I tell people in a concrete way to think of it that the eggs that made you, right, the eggs that created you, were formed inside your grandmother, because your mother was inside your grandmother. And they were influenced perhaps by your great-grandmother and maybe even great-grandmother if they were still alive. And how they related to your mother and the kind of experiences that they had were all brought forward into creating the genetic and the DNA structure of who you are at birth. So again, if we think of this experience, we think of the impact that has come through to people of color today. Unless there was a major shift, right? Unless all of a sudden it was kumbaya and we were all treated with honor and respect and dignity as every human being should be. So these pictures are of Dr. Vanillia Randall's family, showing her great-grandparents who lived through slavery. So that was a whole nother experience, right? Once you got to this land, you weren't allowed to form real solid relationships with your partner or with your children. Men couldn't protect their wives or their women. If they were even allowed to marry, they couldn't protect their children from the ravages of slavery, be it rape, beatings, being sold. Can you imagine watching your child be sold? And maybe not even fully emotionally attaching to your child because you know that she or he's going to be sold. So why are you going to put yourself through that kind of pain to then lose them? You don't have any control over their lives. How debilitating and frustrating that must be until it's incorporated into your DNA generation after generation, and you just stop caring. You just stop really, caring about them and just going through the motions. And even after slavery, Reconstruction and legal apartheid, where people of color were exposed to all kinds of apartheid laws in this country. I remember when I first moved to South Carolina in 1980, the people that I befriended down there remembered having to go to separate water fountains and the back door of restaurants, and they couldn't stay at certain places. So it wasn't that long ago. And it still hasn't ended. These are her grandchildren, especially as young black men in this country. They're still being exposed to violence from police, violence upon each other, because that was learned during slavery. It was kill or be killed. It was make sure I get ahead and I'm not going to worry about you. And also the brainwashing that white is better. So I don't know if any of you have seen a YouTube on video where black children were shown a white doll and a black doll and were asked which one is good, which one is bad, kind, nice, and they attributed all of those positive phrases to the white doll and all the negative phrases to the black doll. That's inherent racism that we have learned. And when they were asked which one looks like you, they really hesitantly pointed to the black doll. They didn't want to acknowledge. It was heartbreaking. They didn't want to acknowledge that the black doll looked like them. So we're carrying all of this forward from the past, from slavery, from the Middle Passage, and we're imprinting it into our children. So even after Jim Crow laws and apartheid was officially over, we were redlined into certain neighborhoods where public services were terrible to poor. There was more crime. There was food deserts. I mean, at least when we lived in the South, we had access to good, healthy vegetables. But when we moved up north, we didn't have access to these things. And furthermore, there was research done to show that when blacks lived in continuous communities in the north, that they had better political representation and they had full-term babies that thrived. When they lived in isolated pockets, as we were sort of pushed into, where they might have been one of few black families, the health disparities were worse because they didn't have the community support that is part of our culture. You know, we're a communal people. We're not meant to live in isolation. I don't think any people are. But as part of our traditions, and you'll see some pictures later, we're a communal people. So these neighborhoods, redlining caused a lot of people to lose their life savings as the value of their homes was pulled out. More crime, just less services. And again, devaluing who we are as a people, forgetting who we are as a people. That's one of the things that happened during slavery, forgetting who we are as a people, forgetting our strength, forgetting our power, forgetting our legacy. So all of this leads to more and more stress that we experience. I'm not going to bore you with science, but when we experience stress, messages go from our hippocampus to release hormones to stimulate the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And then the adrenal glands release more glucocorticoids, which are stress hormones that have really debilitating effects on our entire body. But the result of chronic stress are a number of health conditions, from cardiovascular, cancer, depression, diabetes, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, headaches, insomnia. It also affects our immune system and leads to more obesity. Stress can take you out. Sure can. And there's been lots of documentation, of course, that Black women and men, but we're focusing on women, experience high levels of chronic stress. And when this stress is continual, and in America, we're exposed to chronic, institutional, societal, nutritional, because we don't have good food sources in our community, stress. And this becomes allostatic. This becomes stress that is way beyond what we can deal with, and the result is often, over a period of years, disease process. So looking at it from a life course perspective, if you can imagine a black child and a white child are born at the same state. I don't really believe that, because I know that by the time a black child is born, they've already been exposed to so much stress in utero. So they're really not at the same place, but let's say that they are. The line on top represents life expectancy and resilience and survival of the white baby, who the arrows going up are all factors that support resiliency, support being able to mitigate any stress that they get. The arrows coming down are some stressors that they have. But look at the bottom. Look at the life expectancy, and look at how many more arrows are coming down that this black child is going to have to go through its life. And look at the limited amount of arrows going up to really help them mitigate that stress. So it's no wonder that as they advance through the life course, they're more likely to succumb to premature death, which of course is the ultimate result of stress, chronic disease, disabilities, and just plain being able to function. In utero, how this stress results, so a mother's pregnant, she's exposed to all of this constant daily stress. It could be as little as going into a bank and waiting for somebody to care for you, and you see 6 other Caucasians that came in after you, and they're served. So the result of all this chronic daily stress results in increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, decreased intrauterine blood flow. Her immune system is decreased, so she's more likely to get things like a bacterial vaginal infection, which increases her risk of preterm birth. Her cortisol level increases, so that creates more stress. And the placenta is an amazing organism. It has protective enzymes within the placenta that will help to protect the baby from cortisol level. But when it gets overwhelmed, right? And this increased cortisol goes through to the baby, which further impacts its ability to grow. So rising cortisol has been shown to stimulate labor. The depressed immune system impacts labor. And then the increased cortisol that the baby lives in, like it's living in a state of toxic mess, has epigenetic effects on the baby. And we know that epigenetics is related to our environment. And the mother's uterus is the first environment that the baby is exposed to. So epigenetics basically means that there is an alteration in the gene activity or the gene expression of an individual. And this alteration is not related to mutation in the DNA, RNA transfer, but it impacts how the material from the DNA gets transferred to RNA. This very detailed slide is just showing some of the mechanisms of epigenetics, and epigenetics is influenced by the environment. So just to keep it simple, our environment can be affected by our diet, chemicals, and just general toxins around us, and that all, again, goes back to stress. And some of the specific influences that impacts epigenetic changes come from, of course, drug use, toxic chemicals, disease, diet, as I said, psychological stress, societal influences, drugs, lack of exercise, financial stress. So you could just wrap this all around with a big rainbow called stress, right? So the important thing to take away is that there are critical periods of development where the individual can be impacted by stress and epigenetic changes. So in pregnancy, when the baby's in utero, is one of those critical periods of development. And these critical periods of development are associated with accelerated growth of the organism. So if you can imagine being in uterus and growing from a tiny microscopic egg, to a 8.5, 9-pound baby is a critical period of development. And depending on when the baby is exposed to the greatest amount of stress will impact the organ or the organ system that is developing at that time. And by the time a woman is 3 weeks pregnant, that means that her last period was about 5 weeks ago. The heart starts beating and the brain starts firing. So if you haven't prepared for pregnancy, if you don't know that you're pregnant, you've got stress, you've got epigenetic changes, and you've got all the intergenerational influences that for Black women are insane. Then the heart can be impacted, the brains, the limbs, the eyes. And these changes, these epigenetic changes that are impacted because of the high levels of cortisol and other glucocorticoids are lifelong changes. And remember, it's not just physical changes, it's also emotional and neurological impacts that are going on in utero. And most of this happens before 12 weeks of pregnancy. So if you're not planning, you may not know that you're pregnant till 8, 12 weeks. And I'm real careful not to try to lay guilt trips on women, but a lot of harm can take place with a developing baby during that 8 to 12 weeks. That's why it's so important to prepare. So how do we get here? How do we get here where our beautiful, precocious, intelligent, advanced babies are now just not surviving? I've done a lot of work over the last few years in pre and perinatal psychology. Babies are very intelligent and aware and conscious beings. And we have research to show that at least from the moment of conception, the baby has implicit memory, cellular memory, that can't necessarily be recalled like we can recall something that happened when we were 10, but it's coded, it's imprinted within our cells, within our very DNA. And this explains certain behavior or certain fears or paranoia that we may have that we don't know where it came from. And as I said, it can go back generational. And I believe in being proactive, it can go forward generational. So we have to stop it. So it's important to go back and see how we used to birth and how we used to take care of our children in traditional African culture, and even today in some parts of Africa. So some of you may be familiar with the Dangara tribe and the practices they had, and this is preconception, right? Where the paternal, how should I say this? Paternity had to do with not that the man submitted the sperm to implant the egg, but it had to do with a dream that he may have that he's going to have a child. And then he would go back to his partner and tell her, we got to make a baby. This spirit wants to come through to our family and to our tribe. And so they would conceive. So paternity was seen as established, even if the man was 50 miles away and she had sex with another man, that man didn't have the dream. That wasn't his child. It was the man who had the dream who came back. And then they began to plan for this pregnancy, and the whole community planned for this pregnancy. The community would establish a shrine to pay homage to the incoming spirit. The elders, the elder women especially, would tap into the consciousness of this incoming spirit. It would get to understand who and or what this incoming spirit was in terms of how they were to advance the tribe and serve the tribe and serve the community. Birth was very natural, and they would gather the younger children of the village into a separate room. God forbid they were there at the birth, right? Into a separate room so that when this baby arrived and cried out, the younger children would respond with a cry, a welcoming cry, so that this incoming baby knew that it had landed in the right tribe. Isn't that beautiful? And then, of course, throughout the early part of its life, the elders would remind this baby, this toddler, who it was and how they were to serve. They were reminding them who they were. And the interim, they got all the loving and the nurturing and the constant stimulation from not just their mothers, but the aunties and the older siblings. And birth was traditional. It was attended by a midwife, minimal, there was no technology. Sometimes it was, in environments that we wouldn't probably want to birth in today. But birth was very natural, and it was very, they were surrounded by other women who supported them and massaged them and nurtured them in the birth. So during slavery and Reconstruction, it was the granny midwives who continued this tradition, right? The granny midwives in the South who didn't just attend births for poor black women, but oftentimes for white women. And as was mentioned earlier, there were elder black women that oftentimes would breastfeed the white babies or the black babies whose mothers just weren't up to it for whatever reason. These are some pictures of some granny midwives. Actually, Maud Collin was a nurse midwife, but Margaret Smith was a granny midwife. I don't remember the name of the woman on the right, but I just love her hands. Look at those hands. They just look so welcoming and so loving to welcome that baby in. They preserved the tradition until the Shepherd-Towner Act in 1924, I believe, basically blamed the high rate of infant and maternal mortality on midwives, and they gave grants to many states for public health nurses to increase the skills of the midwives. But what happened, unfortunately, was that because many of the midwives, they weren't schooled, didn't have any formal training, couldn't reach the levels of skills that was required, they actually, went out of business. On top of that, there was a Flexner report of 1910 that, again, ended up in almost the disappearance of midwives in this country. And then the biggest blow was after World War II. And remember, at this point, black women were still pretty much giving birth at home, surrounded by other women. But after World War II, there were still quite a few medical schools and many hospitals, and not enough women birthing in hospitals. So there was a massive brainwashing campaign to make women believe that birth was horrible and terrible. They were, at that time, from the early 20th century, male midwives were already going into the home of wealthy women and giving them ether and chloroform to make birth not painful, and using forceps. So after World War II, when poor women, especially black women, were given Medicaid cards, they could now go into these hospitals to birth. And, they were welcomed in the hospitals as warm bodies for the medical students to practice upon. And remember that there was, during slavery, black women were used to perform C-sections without any medication. So anyway, after World War II, black women went into the hospitals. They were able to get ether and chloroform, so forget it. They could not remember births. Many of them had forceps, even when they didn't need forceps. They didn't breastfeed. The babies, first of all, when the babies were born, they were knocked out for 3 days because of twilight sleep. They were zoned out. And of course they had to be monitored, right? So they were in nurseries, somewhere else in the hospital. They weren't with their mothers. And there was no nurturing. There was no cuddling. I think that the worst thing that we can do to our babies, no matter if they're white, pink, black, blue, green, is to separate them from their mothers. It's really like post-traumatic stress. If you think of this little baby inside its mother for 9 months, her smell, her heartbeat, her endorphins that are coming through, and then when it is born, first of all, during twilight sleep days, they were knocked out. It is totally taken away from that person. Can you imagine how scary that is? Can you imagine how completely confusing that must be? And perhaps you can recover from that if your mother had the awareness once she was able to hold you to never let you go, right? But they would bring the mothers the babies for maybe 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night, bottle feed on schedule. So unlike these African babies that fed when they wanted, if the baby was starving, it couldn't get fed because you don't eat till 12 o'clock or 4 o'clock or whatever. And then, of course, during the Dr. Spock years, we were taught to leave our babies alone, let them cry themselves to sleep. What does that do for your psyche? How do you trust your environment? How do you trust your mother that she's going to be there for you and protect you and love you? Remember, the African babies were never left alone. They were constantly cuddled, massaged, caressed, sung to. That's what babies need. That's what babies need. So then we lost our way, right? We went into the hospital. We birthed alone. We first had twilight sleep, and then we had epidurals. Our babies were wrapped up and swaddled and put in a crib at some other part of the hospital. Many of us were born by C-section. We'll talk about that in a minute. And not only were babies bottle fed, but as soon as they could, they were given a bottle to hold by themselves and propped up. Where's the love in that? So C-sections, crazy, right? We've gone from a 6% C-section rate back in the 1990s, I believe, to now we're over 35%. And if you look at this, look where black babies are. They're way up there. They're way up there. And what's the problem with C-sections? First of all, it has increased the maternal mortality rate because it is major surgery. No matter what it's just a common everyday procedure. It's major surgery. You can have damage to your bladder, intestines. You could lose your uterus. There's more risk of infection and bleeding. C-section babies don't have the benefit of wiggling their way through the vagina. A little stress, but important for survival. So they're born with more fluid in their lungs. So they got to go to the NICU. And that impacts breastfeeding, right? Plus it's separation. And the recovery time for the mother is longer and more painful. So she just may not be able to get into that nurturing behavior as she would with a vaginal birth. And we're no longer breastfeeding like we should. Black women just, on the average, just don't breastfeed their babies compared to European women. I think our breastfeeding rates are, in some places, 50% of Caucasian women. So our babies aren't getting the nurturing. They're getting artificial formula that is, I'm sorry, it's just not good for the babies, unless, there's some other reason why the babies can't get breast milk. But we've also gotten away from feeding each other's babies. And that's a better option often than formula. So I want to introduce Joe to you. Joe is actually a client that I had for a very short time through my work with pre and perinatal psychology. So Joe's mother was a victim of society and racism. She did drugs during the pregnancy, alcohol, smoked, was very promiscuous, had many sex partners. And Joe, as babies are, was aware of all of this. And he was angry. And at 25 weeks, as he told me, he tried to go out the back door from the uterus, which meant he tried to abort himself. Babies have a right to choose to leave. The back door was shut closed. So he came through the front door. And she went to the hospital because she was having pains. When they pulled the sheets away from her, he had come through the vagina. It was this little teeny 1.5 pound thing just laying there. And then he spent, he couldn't stand it anymore. He remembered the smell, the cloud in the amniotic fluid from all the barbiturates and the cocaine, how he felt when she was having sex with different men. He remembered all of that. He was angry. He spent 11 weeks in an incubator. And in that incubator, the only thing, so he was hearing these loud noises, bright lights, not really being touched or held or even spoken to. And the only thing that probably helped him survive, well, two things. One, he's a fighter. We're incredibly resistant. And two, his grandmother would come to visit him daily. Unfortunately, that story is not unusual for Black women in this country because of the stress and everything else that we've talked about. And we know preterm babies are more likely to have long-lasting physical and physiological and psychological impact, and they're more likely to die before they're a year old. Sometimes before they're a month old. They just say, I'm out of here. So we got to go back to basics. In our traditional culture, we did a lot of ritual. We did a lot of communal eating, communal dancing. We were community, period. We were a village. We passed on traditions through oral language, but also through action, again, through ritual. We initiated our young women and our young men, which doesn't happen today. We honored each other. We celebrated one another. We honored our children. We loved our children, not just our children that we birthed, but everybody else's children in the village. We all took care of them. They were the children. So where do we begin? We know that the odds are against our babies and our mothers, but I'm an eternal optimist, and we have to find ways to even the odds. We have to find ways to mitigate the stress. And we have to recognize and acknowledge babies right from the start. Babies learn a lot in utero. Eastern cultures have known this for centuries. We're just discovering it, that babies are aware, sentient, conscious beings. And, if their mother's having a particularly hard time while she's pregnant, I'm going to talk about prenatal bonding, it's important for the mother to explain to the baby that it's not you. I'm not stressed out and crying because of you, because babies are extremely narcissistic. But that's okay. We know somebody else who is. So we have to acknowledge our babies, because maybe one of the reasons they leave is because they don't feel loved and acknowledged. And remember, that's part of their DNA to expect that, and they're just not getting it anymore. So preconception care enables us to do genetic screening, order other lab tests, get our weight under control so that we have less problems with our weight. Obesity can cause a lot of problems in pregnancy. We have to address coexisting health issues, diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, anemia. We can't do much about sickle cell, but interesting what I found out is that in traditional African diets, yams are very popular. And so women who eat a lot of yams in West Africa, for example, may not even discover that they have sickle cell anemia until they get here. And they add a lot of wheat and grain, other grains and sugar and to their diet, and then sickle cell expresses itself. Epigenetics, right? So we've got to improve our diets with whole fresh fruit and vegetables and healthy proteins and lots of good water and keeping our sugar down. I went through 2 vegetarian pregnancies and paid particular attention to my diet because, of course, everybody, and this was 20, almost 30 years ago, everybody thought it was a really bad thing to do. We got to get enough sleep, and we got to work in our relationships. Unfortunately, many of our men are incarcerated, so it's really hard to work on those relationships. And I recognize that relationships aren't always male-female, but whatever they are, we have to work on improving those relationships, the way we communicate, the way we deal with stress, the way we express anger, learn how to talk better to each other, massage each other. We've got to improve our relationships because the best thing we can do for our babies, even before they're born, is have healthy relationships. Make sure that we have a good support system around us. Get our support people in order. Of course, we've got to avoid toxic substances that can have epigenetic influences of our babies in utero. And if we have addictions, work through those addictions before we get pregnant, because it's hard on the baby for you to get rid of addictions, particularly if they're things like heroin, cocaine, even alcohol, before you after you're pregnant, because then the baby goes through withdrawal in utero and there's really not much support for the baby. Stress, we've got to practice stress reduction, meditation, yoga, chanting, dancing, ritual, doing whatever we can for us that helps us take our stress level from here, that allopathic state, down to here. Got to get on some vitamins, especially folic acid. Got to monitor our menstrual cycle so that we know when we get pregnant and we can say to the doctor or the midwife, this is when my last period was, this is when I conceived, so that they're not throwing a bunch of stupid tests on you as early as 5 weeks, sonogram and after sonogram after sonogram. We really don't know the impact of all those sonograms. I went through 2 pregnancies with no sonograms. So, and this is important, we got to plan our pregnancies. We have to plan our conceptions. We have to conceive in joy and with intention, because at the moment of conception, where you are psychologically, if you imagine, it goes into the makeup, the matrix of that prenate, that embryo. So of course, if you don't do all these things, it's not like you're going to give birth to a psychotic baby, but they're all little things that we can do, right? And I'm talking about the ideal. And you've got to choose your care provider. As a midwife for almost 40 years, I've worked in clinics, I've worked in different environments, and I see so many Black women that came into clinics and they didn't make the choice. They just came because it was there. And they expected us as the providers to make all the decisions and the choices for them, which is a really dangerous thing to do. It's a really dangerous thing to do because they don't necessarily have your best interests in heart. It's really about their training and how many procedures they can get under their belt. And the more procedures they order, the more they're reimbursed. So we really have to protect our babies and make better choices when we're pregnant. So preconception planning, exercise, great water, talking, good diet, spending time together, being in love. Let's conceive our babies with love and not with anger and bitterness and all those negative energies going into our conception. You got to really take some time to think about what kind of care provider do you want? Do you want somebody who's going to be paternalistic and tell you what to do and order a bunch of tests and not explaining them to you and say you have to do this? Or do you want somebody who's going to take the time and listen and put you in the center of the pregnancy? It would be nice to put the baby in, but the baby can't necessarily talk. So put you in the center of pregnancy and enable you to make choices and decisions as to what should take place in your pregnancy and your birth. Really consider a midwife, not just because I'm a midwife, but our outcomes are better, or at least the same. You know, there was a National Birth Center study, and in that study, the birth center patients had a 6% C-section rate, and this was in late 1980s, as opposed to a 27% C-section rate in hospitals, and that rate has gone up. Less episiotomies, and the maternal and infant mortality was better or the same. But not only that, midwives tend to be more culturally sensitive. Ideally, if you could find a midwife from your culture, even better. The visits are longer, they do more patient education and empowerment, they listen. Midwife means with woman, which means that, you know, they should be listening to you, making a heart-to-heart connection with you, finding out what you want for your birth. And they're more patient in labor. So they're more likely to wait and not rush you back to the OR because you crunch your toes too tight. And they do more natural birth, more physiological birth, less episiotomies. Epidural babies don't do the breast crawl. You know, when you put the baby on the lower abdomen, first of all, the baby's going to rest because it's exhausted from birth. But if you leave that baby long enough, it will crawl its way to the breast because it knows the scent and it's going closer to the heartbeat that it knows. Babies who are drugged in labor, they don't do the breast crawl. And these babies also have less control of their head and they're less able to effectively breastfeed right away. So babies need love and to be acknowledged right from the start. So we got to do prenatal bonding. You know, we got to spend time every day to sit in quiet and talk to our babies, sing to our babies, massage our abdomens. Being pregnant is the most important job you can do as a woman. I mean, I don't care if you could be, you know, a CEO of a corporation making $500,000 a year. It is not as important as having a baby. So why don't we spend time, absolutely, Ashe, why don't we spend time loving our babies, nurturing our babies, letting them know that we care for them, that we're going to be there for them. Talk to them about the kind of birth you're hoping for, who's going to be at your birth. When I had both my children, I invited a couple younger women, my sister and cousins in the family, because I wanted them to experience birth in a natural way, right, before they had babies. That's so important. So we need to take the time to sit in contemplation and sing to our babies and explain to them what's going on in your day. And families need to bond with babies, partners, fathers, older children. One of the great things about going to a midwife is, you know, they'll let you listen to the heartbeat, let the children listen, they'll teach you how to feel which way the baby's laying in the uterus. My ex-husband used to use my belly button as the microphone to the baby so he could talk to them. And there's more research that shows that when the babies are born, they recognize the voice of mom. They recognize the voice of the partner, the father, whoever's there throughout the pregnancy. So that's so important. In traditional Africa, it wasn't just the mothers that carried the babies around, it was the older siblings, right? So that bonding needs to begin in utero so that the baby understands that it's here and it's loved and it's going to stay. It's not going to check out at 6 or 9 months. Choose your place of birth. This is so important. Do you want to give birth in a birth center where you have, or home where you have more control? It's your environment. When I would go into somebody's home to attend a birth, I was keenly aware that I was a guest in their space. I had to follow their rules, and I was only there to assist. A birth center is similar to that, but you have to establish that this is my birth, and for the next 12, 14 hours, this is my space. Hospitals is really hard to maintain control. They have all these rules, all these things that you can and can't do. No, you can close the door, you can get butt naked because the doctors are less likely to walk in if you're butt naked. And it's more comfortable. And it's your birth. And you got to write a birth plan and be real adamant about what you want in that birth plan. You don't want separation from your baby. You don't want any drugs. You don't want an epidural, but you got to prepare yourself for those things, right? Because labor is tough. That's why it's called labor. It's not a walk in the park. And you got to have support, a supportive partner, supportive family. So at the home of the birth center, you can have as many people as you want there with you, which is really nice. Where in the hospital, you may have limitations as to how many people can be there with you. Back to choosing your birth. You want to give birth in the water? Water birth is absolutely amazing. And the American College of Obstetrician and Gynecologists say, okay, you can labor in the water, but you can't give birth in the water because we don't know how dangerous it is. The baby may drown. In this country, we don't keep babies underwater when they're born. We get their heads out so they can breathe. But for the mother, water is incredibly relaxing. It helps to move the labor along, and it's not as painful. And the babies are coming from a warm 98 degrees, right, into a warm 98 degrees. The transition is wonderful. You know, we came from water, we should birth in water. It's a wonderful way to give birth. The first water birth I attended was for a pastor and his wife. And when the baby actually came out, they played the Hallelujah chorus. It was just amazing. Delay cord blood clamping, right? That means that when your baby is born and its circulatory system is trying to adjust to extrauterine life, and it's very different than how blood circulates in utero, it may take the baby a little while. It's gone through the stressful birth, and then its whole circulatory system has to cross over. Why don't we leave the baby getting some blood and oxygen, right, for as long as it takes for the cord to stop pulsating, right? And now they have these stupid guidelines, 2 minutes if the baby's here, 5 minutes if the baby's there, 1 minute. No, leave it until the cord stops pulsating. The baby will get as much as 80 millimeters additional blood. It protects the baby from intracerebral edema, and it also makes sure that the baby gets more iron, so that by the time the baby's 6 months old, they have more hemoglobin. And we know that breast milk doesn't have a lot of iron, but they don't need it because they're getting it, they're getting a store from the delayed cord blood clamping. So now this is kind of like one of these popular things that some women are given the choice and some women aren't. As much as 20 years ago, I did not cut cords right away because it was my passive-aggressive way of not letting the nurse take the baby away from the mother so that the two had to stay together. So that is a choice that you can put in your birth plan. And it's so important for the baby because it keeps the baby attached to the mother, skin to skin, getting all of the benefits of that practice. And of course, skin to skin, not just for the mother, but also for the father or the partner. So bonding at birth is real important. We already talked about the birth crawl, skin to skin. Birth should be quiet, and especially after the baby's born. Nobody yelling, pushing, yelling at you to push, 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 and you pushing your brains out. Birth should be gentle. The polyvagal theory is a fairly new theory that was developed, I think, about 40 years ago. And it involves 3% of the vagus nerve that is myelinated at birth, which means it's active. And this nerve, this 3% innervates eyes, the muscles that make you smile, the muscles in the middle ear that can enable you to hear. And the theory is that when this part of the brain is functioning at birth, so the baby is able to get eye-to-eye contact and look at its mother. It's able to coo. It's able to smell. It's able to hear what the mother is saying. And there's an entrainment that happens between the mother and the baby. So when the baby displays this kind of behavior, it's just magical. The mother's oxytocin levels increase, and that's the love hormone if she hasn't been pitted to death in labor. And it turns on her nurturing behavior, which is so important for a human baby because they're helpless. They can't do anything for themselves. So it's so important for mothers and babies to get that time alone together, to get entrained with each other. And when a baby's in a NICU or in a nursery elsewhere, the baby doesn't get that. So for preterm babies, you've got to insist that if my baby's preterm, I want to do kangaroo mother care. I want to wear my baby, which means you got to take the time out to be in the nursery and wear your baby. They can still attach the baby to the oxygen and all the monitors, but your baby's skin to skin with you. You have to insist on your birth plan that if I have to have a C-section, I want these 2 or 3 things absolutely to happen, even in the OR. I want skin to skin, I want dim lights, and I want everybody to be quiet so the baby can hear me. And I want to breastfeed as soon as possible in recovery. So polyvagal includes the eye movement, the eye contact, the movement, smell, suckling. And remember, babies, as somebody said, all nurse differently. Some of them will come out and grab that breast like barracudas, and some will take a while. And we got to be patient, and we got to let them smell and sniff and snuckle and get it together. We got to be patient with them. So absolutely, breast is best. And it's not just the nutrients. We all know about the incredible nutrients in breastfeeding, but it's that closeness. It's that eye-to-eye contact. It's that look of love that goes from mother to baby. And it is, it's the orgasmic effects that the woman feels. It turns on more love hormones to her baby. It's part of survival for the baby. That's part of why our babies are dying, because they don't get this, right? So from the beginning of time, women has breastfed, and we've got to continue that tradition. So it really takes a village, and that means going back to community. Women shouldn't have to go through pregnancy alone. They shouldn't have to birth alone. They shouldn't have to go through postpartum alone where they may be a little bit down. There should be somebody there bringing them food and massaging them and caressing them and cleaning their house and taking care of their older children. They should be loved so that they can love their babies. And we've moved away from that. We have to begin to care for each other, to love each other, to support each other so that we can be the mothers that we can be. We all have that potential. And we can nurture our babies, and we can help them to grow to their highest potential. The final word about babies: we know they're talented, precocious, amazing, extremely competent, they're conscious from the beginning. They want to be loved and acknowledged. They're very narcissistic. All their senses are working by the end of the first trimester. They're able to communicate and entrain with the mother at birth. And their neurological, psychological, physiological adjustment at birth is dependent on being close to the mother. And events in utero in the first 2 years of life can have lifelong impact on this baby. And this is what we're aiming for, right? So, any questions?
My name is Jeanette, and I'm the president of our local breastfeeding coalition. And I'm just amazed and touched with all the information and wisdom you gave us. One thing that I'd like to have you address is here in our county where we are, we do have a higher rate of African American babies dying. Some of the interventions that are taking place are a campaign to make sure babies are sleeping safely. That involves, it's the ABCs, it's called alone, on their back, and in a crib. And I'd like to get your response to see, you know, the amount of information you're talking about, the importance of breastfeeding, how that can be taken into account, because often it's very natural for a mother to have her baby next to her and to be able to give her baby her breast milk, and I think that's being missed. But I'd like to hear your perspective on how we can make sure that breastfeeding is an important part of preventing from babies from, you know, dying from SIDS.
Yes. And I'm glad you said you brought this up, because it's very important. And it's not just my beliefs, but what I've learned through the work of pre and perinatal psychology is babies need their mothers. They need to be close to their mothers. And traditionally, babies were not made to sleep alone and in a crib and were still in another room. They were close to their mothers. And I think that is one of the toughest teachings that we're giving women, especially poor Black women, and it doesn't support breastfeeding unless a woman has some other extenuating circumstances. Babies need to be close to their mothers. And if you're breastfeeding, you can just roll over on your side and nurse your baby. It's very rare that a woman is going to roll over on her baby. But you can roll over on your side and nurse your baby and go back to sleep. I used to do that half awake. And the baby is very happy. And there are some little devices that you can get to prevent rollover, but babies need that closeness. And I think we're doing a great disservice teaching women that babies need to be alone and on their backs. They can still be on their backs in bed and in another room with a monitor monitoring them rather than you. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I wondered if you could very briefly talk about how, knowing that you talked about the high C-section rate that Black mothers receive, and if you could talk about how to support women that are in the hospital and how to avoid some C-section avoidance, things that people can do when they're with a woman or supporting a woman or the woman herself.
One of little response, we got to get support. Women should not go through pregnancy or birth alone. And if you don't have support, there are many doula programs, and there's some doula programs that are specifically for Black women. Find a doula. Do training to be a doula. Wonderful, because you can go into the hospitals with the women, you can support them postpartum. It's part of building that community and that support. So great. I thank you for the work you're doing.
Hello, my name's Dr. Lee Turner Johnson. I'm here. First of all, I was just so moved. I'm so glad I came because your stories have moved me on so many levels. But I'm going to be brief and just highlight how you've moved me. And first of all, I want to say that I'm a commissioner for First Five. I served on the advisory council for 4 years, and I've been a First Five commissioner for Sac County for just a little over a year. So I bring greetings and support and love from them. I also just want to say that I was a white woman with 1 in 100,000 chances of losing. I'm only going to say this quickly, even though it was 34 years ago, and I lost my baby in a wonderful hospital in Berkeley. Who would know? But it was before they designed things about families that came together that had propensity for bleeding, and I had placental separation at the last minute, scheduled for a center at the hospital, a room, privately, and hemorrhaged. And my little full-term, 7.5 pound, 21-inch baby girl didn't make it. So I know I'm 1 in 100,000 compared to the rates we're dealing with the African American population. I understand, but I know the pain. Okay, exactly. The last thing I want to say, because I can't be here and not say this, I'm Grantland Johnson's wife. And you know, he was part of the strategic planning for the African American infant mortality. One of his last meetings that he went to was the African American, so I bring love from him.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say that when you lose a baby, you're not one in any amount. You're you. And you're an individual, and it's painful. You're not a statistic.
Hi, Dr. Clark. I'm Jackie Washington Ansley, Senior Public Health Nurse here in our wonderful Sacramento County. I'm also the Perinatal Services Coordinator, the SIDS Coordinator, and wear other hats. I would like to applaud you for the work that you're doing, and also to encourage you and more people to really take a look at our communities and encourage pregnant women to take the time to listen to our community advocates who are here in the county. This county may be big and sprawled out. We're really big, but we do have resources here. We have some of the best parenting programs here in Sacramento County. We have WIC all over, and a lot of people don't show up. And as a perinatal service worker, I have called women at home. I have parents call me when their infant has passed away from a sleep-related death. And the first thing I asked were you in a pregnancy support program? No, no one told me. I didn't go. Please, people in Sacramento County, refer our mothers, especially African American women, to the programs that we do have here. They're free, they're available. Please enroll in WIC and go. They're free and they're available. There's Black Mothers United, there's a cultural broker program, there's Nurse Family Partnership, there's Black Infant Health. We have programs here that are available to prevent Black infant mortality that will help you, give you the support, reduce your stress, make resources available for transportation and getting the food you need. But we must go, so we have to encourage. And if you can only do one thing, when you see that pregnant woman in the store, on the bus stop, at church, how are you doing? Do you have what you need? Right. Let me tell you, call 211, call Sacramento County. They have free service for you. These services, I'm really afraid, are going to be gone in the next 4 to 8 years. If we do not participate now, people will think that we have no interest, and they will cut them out.
We have to support and take care of ourselves. When I worked with the Brooklyn Perinatal Network in Brooklyn, we engaged beauty parlors, businesses. Somebody's there getting their hair done. Oh, you're pregnant. Are you in prenatal care? Do you know this service available, that service available? We really, really have to build community because the Black church is disintegrating and the community supports are just not there. And I know that the perinatal networks do some amazing jobs. And I have to say, I'm really grateful to Ron and Shauna for putting this event on, but I'm saddened. Thank you. I'm saddened that this room isn't overflowing. right? Because this is about our babies and our mothers dying, and why shouldn't we want to find out all we can find out about changing that?
This Access Sacramento Hometown TV event is available for purchase on DVD. For more information, call 916-456-8600, extension 0. This has been a special Hometown TV broadcast from Access Sacramento. This program is funded in part by a grant from the Sacramento Metropolitan Cable Television Commission.